Previous releases of ASP.NET MVC included scaffolding features. These scaffolding features could generate controllers and views based on your model definitions. When using the entity framework, the generated code would include everything you need from data access code to UI code, everything needed for listing and editing instances of the model. This release of ASP.NET MVC is no different. There's still scaffolding, although the scaffolding has been updated both in the internals and also in the UI. We'll talk more about that later when we take a closer look at Visual Studio in a later module. The goal for this clip will be to generate a controller and views that will allow a user to list, edit, create, and delete books. But like in the real world, the scaffolding won't give us exactly what we need, so we'll customize the generated code. Really, the scaffolding is intended to be just a starting point in any case, so let's take a look. Now that we have a database, let's close some of these windows and create some UI. So I will go to the controllers folder, right-click that, say I want to add a controller. I want an MVC5 controller with views using the entity framework. In order for the scaffolder to build this out, it needs some information, like the name of the controller. I want that to be the books controller. The name of the model, that is what entity or what object do I want to insert, list, edit, and delete. I want that to be book objects. What should the controller use to talk to the database? That should be BooksDB. I'll leave all the other settings in place. I'll even leave the use async controller actions unchecked because we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then when I click add, the scaffolding engine will jump in. It will reflect over the model. It'll build out a controller that uses my DB context to talk to the books table in the database. And it'll use information about the model to scaffold out views that will allow the user to edit the information and see the information. So here you can see the BooksDB is instantiated in the controller. The index action by default will pull out all the books from the database, put them into a list, and hand that off to the view for rendering. Obviously, that will need some paging in the future when we have tens of thousands of books in the database. But if you want to see how paging and searching is implemented, watch my Building Applications with ASP.NET MVC. I do that in that course. One change I would like to make to the scaffolded controller is I would like to add an authorize attribute. We know now that only authenticated users can reach the functionality inside of here now. And before I run it, I will probably need a link in the navigation bar to get to this functionality easily. So in the layout view, where we build the navigation bar, I will take the link for the home page, copy that, paste it in here, and just change the parameters. I want it to display the text books and go to the index action of the books controller. And with that change in place, let's run the application and see what it looks like. And I can get to the home page, which is good. I have a books link, also good. MVC framework detects that I am an anonymous user, doesn't let me in there. That's also good. I'll need to register with a new user account. And now that I am registered, I'm also logged in. I should be able to go to books once more and see there's no books in the database, which is fine. We'll need to create a new book. Now the create view is interesting. It is placed here in input type equals text for the title. Freeform text entry will be good when the user needs to enter a book title, but there's also freeform text entry for category. There is some validation there to make sure that the user fills out something, but I obviously don't want the user to be able to type in a category. They need to select from one of the predefined categories that already exist. Those categories are defined by an enum. Unfortunately, the scaffolding doesn't know what to do with an enum property. Right now, it just renders an input type equals text, and the user could type anything they want in here. Most of what they would probably type wouldn't work. If we open up the create view for books, what we'll see is that both title and category are using one of the templated helpers, editor4. What a templated helper will do is look at this property and its type and find out the best template to render an editor for that type. So if title is a string, it will find a string template that's built into the MVC framework, and that renders an input type equals text. Now there is no built-in template for a custom type like genre, which is what category is. So the MVC framework falls back to one of the built-in templates, which will just render that input type equals text. What I want to do here is provide a custom template for genre to display a drop-down list, and the user can only select one of the categories that I know about. The way to create an editor template, something that is selected by editor4, is to have a folder called editor templates. And I can have that in the shared folder, in which case the template will be available throughout the application, or I could have that just in the books folder, and the template's only available when I'm rendering inside of here. I'll create essentially a global template. And I can override the built-in MVC templates when I do this, but I need a view because templates are basically just razor views. It's going to be a partial view, and the name is very important. The name I want for this is genre, because by default, what the MVC framework will do when you say editor for something that is of type string, it will go looking for a template named string, and there's one built in. When I say editor for category, and category is a genre, it will go looking for a template named genre. And I can prove that just by putting in some text into this view. And if I refresh this page, we'll see that text appear. So it has selected my template to render this editor for. Now what we need is a real editor. And obviously this is a bit of a tangent from the entity framework, but it's a scenario I see come up all the time, and it's not something I cover in the building applications courses. So let me show you one approach to this. Ultimately, what I need is a drop-down list to appear, an HTML select item. That drop-down list, I have to pass it the name to use. I'm just going to pass it an empty string. What will happen inside of these HTML helpers when I give it an empty string for the name is it will ultimately fall back to using the name of the property. So if I do html.editor for category and use html.dropdownList without specifying a name, it will fall back to using category, which is perfect because that's what the model binder will expect when this information posts back to the web server and is trying to push information into the book model for me. It'll find an input called category, it'll find a property on the book called category, and it'll match those two up. The other bit of information that I need to provide are some select list items. And there's a couple different ways to get to select list items. I could create a new list of select list item. This would be one way to do it, and just by hand create select list items whose text is equal to some value and whose value is equal to a genre value, like 0, 1, 2, or 3. But the obvious drawback here is that if anyone goes in and adds an additional genre, they'll have to remember to come into this template and add a new select list item. So instead of building this manually, what I would like to do is somehow build that information using the enum type. In other words, I would actually like to reflect over the genre type and find out what names are inside of here and what values are associated with each name. So I want to be able to see action as a name, and the default value for that should be a 2. So it might be nice to take something like the genre type, which is in a different namespace. Let me add a using here for books.entities. It might be nice to take that genre type and say something like get items and have an extension method defined somewhere that will reflect over this and pull out the items and the names and essentially build me an IEnumerable of select list items. Let's try to build that. I'll add a folder called helpers. Inside of helpers, I will add a class called enum helpers. And this will be a public static class because it will contain some extension methods. And what I will need is an extension method for type called getItems. So public static, it's going to return an IEnumerable of select list item. Select list item, I want the one that is in system.web.mvc. Very important to use that particular namespace. The extension method is called getItems, and it is an extension for type. That will be the enum type. One of the checks I should probably have in here is to make sure that that really is an enum type and you didn't pass me type of book or something like that. So I could check to make sure that type of enum is assignable from this enum type, because if it is not, I can then throw an exception, perhaps an argument exception with a simple error message. Type must be an enum. But if we pass that check, now it's time to look at this type, figure out what names are in here and what values are associated with them. Well, fortunately, names are very easy to get to. I can just say enum.getNames for this given type. What that will return is an array of string. Those strings will be nonfiction, action, romance, science fiction. Turns out to also be easy to get the values. I can call getValues for this enum type. The one catch to get values is that it returns an untyped array. but I really need a type. I need something that implements IEnumerable of t here. Well, the default underlying type for an enum will be integer. It doesn't have to be integer, but this should work for anything that uses the defaults. I'll just cast those values, each of them, into an integer. Now I have an IEnumerable of string, which is the names, an IEnumerable of int, which is the values. I need to stitch them together. A link operator that I can use to do that is zip. So if you've never used zip, it's like the zipper on a code. It stitches together two sequences. It takes the first item from names and the first item from values, and it pairs them together. Then it'll take the second item from names and the second item from values and pair them together. And it keeps doing that until it reaches the end of the sequences. And what I need to provide is that each time it pairs together a name and a value, I need to provide a lambda expression that describes what to do with that particular pairing. So for each pairing, I want to turn that into a select list item. A select list item where the text is the name, the value is value.toString, so take the integer and convert it into a string, and that should give me an IEnumerable of select list items that I can return to the caller. And now to use this extension method, I should take this namespace, come into my view, and for it to be recognized by the C# compiler, I'll need to have a using statement for that. And then apply a semicolon here. Let's see if this is working. Do a build. I did miss or deleted somehow one of my closing curly braces, so add that in. We can now build, and if I refresh, hopefully I'll get a drop-down list with nonfiction, romance, action, and science fiction. Very good. So now I don't have those values hard-coded into the application. I'm pulling them out of the enum. The obvious drawback here is that when I get a name, there's a chance it might not be a user-friendly name. A user would expect to see a space between science and fiction. One way I've solved this in the past is to add display attributes to my enum fields. Display is another one of those system.componentModel.dataAnnotations attributes. I can say display name equals nonfiction. This would be one way to do it. And then I could also take that display attribute and add it to science fiction. And now what I need to do in my helper, instead of using this name directly, I should check that particular field of the enum type to see if there's a display attribute, and if there is, use its name. If that display attribute is not there, just use the default, which is the name from the enum itself. That will work for romance and action. Let's see if we can make that part happen. So I expect that I will need to call something like another method. I'll put this in another method. I'll need to call that, give it the enum type so it can reflect over it, and also the starting name to look up or use. And so down here, a new private method, one that returns string. It's called getName. You give me an enum type and a name, and I'll figure out if it has a display attribute on there or not. If it doesn't, what I could do is default the result to just the underlying name. So in the case of action and romance, this will pass in action. I won't find a display attribute because there's none there. So I'll just return the string action. But for something like nonfiction, now I need to see if there's a display attribute there. That's just a few lines of length. First, so we need to find the attribute. Let's go to the enum type, get the field that has that name. Then I need to see if it has any attributes. I can do that by calling get custom attributes. I have to pass in a flag to say whether I want inherited attributes. I don't expect there to be any, so just pass a false. And then I don't want just any custom attribute. I want attributes of type display attribute. And I'll need to bring in the namespace for that again, system.componentModel.dataAnnotations. And once I've filtered it down to just display attributes, just give me the first one that you find or a null reference. So if there is an attribute and it's not equal to null, in that case, what I want to do is set the result and say that result equals attribute.getName. That method will pull out the name that I've specified here. If I've done this all correctly, I should be able to do a build, and I forgot a comma. or I deleted that comma when I changed this over to use get name, do a build that's building, refresh the page, and now we're using that display attribute. So nonfiction displays as non-space fiction. We have science space fiction. This is all very good. Let's create a romance novel. A romance novel called ASP.NET NVC. Create this book, and I can see it in the list. Fortunately, enum values will display correctly, although I wonder if it will work for science fiction. Let's edit this value and try to change it to science fiction, but already I notice a problem. I created a romance book, but this is showing as nonfiction. That's because I'm not setting the selected item inside of here. When I create a select list item, I should find the one that represents the current value of the model and say selected equals true. The default will be false. This will require me to pass in the selected value, which could be nullable, or you might not have a model value. So I'm just going to take a nullable int to be safe. And I will say if the value equals that selected value, then yes, mark this item as selected. And now in the view, I will need to pass in the current value of the model, if there is one. So these templates have a model property just like regular views that represents the information that is passed in. That would represent, in this case, the category value, the value of that enum. So now, one more quick build to save everything. Refresh this book, and I can see it has now properly rendered romance. And if I change it to science fiction, now we're back to the problem where we are displaying the literal enum name. How would I solve this problem? Well, inside of the index view, and I'm going to have to leave this as a bit of an exercise for the viewer, but inside of the index view, it is using a display for category. And to solve that problem, it would be very similar to what I did with editor templates. Display for uses display templates, so I could create that folder, create a view called genre.cshtml, and that template would need to take that value and convert it into a user-friendly string. It could do that by looking up the display attributes. But what I've shown you so far, I hope, is some help, and that is I have an entity that has a property of type enum. Instead of just allowing free-form text entry, what we've done is we've customized the editor template to display a drop-down list. That editor template uses reflection to look at the genre type and pull out these values and display a much nicer user interface than the default scaffolding gives us. So now that we've done this, let's move on and go back to the controller and look at how we can use async features of the entity framework.